The topic of today's talk, I've intentionally titled it Sunlight and Cancer Beyond Skin Deep. And the purpose of that is because I believe that there is sufficient evidence to support a profound role of natural sunlight in supporting health and in supporting cancer. And given Australia, particularly our narrative and our discussions and experiences with skin cancer and attitudes to sun, that I think this is going to be an important exploration of the whole story, or part of the whole story. So cancer is a growing problem, and sometimes I like to look at economic data because it can tell a very, very interesting story in and of itself. But these companies, these are the most profitable pharmaceutical companies in the world. And this business website made the comment that the global oncology drugs market was valued at $201 billion in 2023. And this is forecast to grow to $518 billion by 2030. What did they attribute this market growth down to? Well, factors such as the rising prevalence of different types of cancers, increasing new drug launches and product approvals, and growing research activities by pharma companies in the field. So what is cancer? I mean, a definition of cancer, any various malignant neoplasms characterized by the proliferation of anaplastic or dedifferentiated cells that tend to invade surrounding tissues and metastasize to new body sites. That's interesting, but what causes cancer? That's not going to be the topic of today's talk, but I'll give you a couple of insights into perhaps the latest of what we think about could be causing cancer. And these are perspectives from some of the top researchers in the world. Professor Thomas Segree talks about a metabolic disorder, mitochondrial metabolic disorder. Professor Michael Levin is talking about the loss of cellular coherence and from a bioelectric point of view, and potential regression of that cell into a more embryonic state. And also Dr. Jack Kruse has talked about the altering of Warburg metabolism, but really one being reliant on a change in light signals. But as I mentioned, that's not going to be the topic of today's talk. What I want to talk about is sunlight and cancer particularly, and the link between sunlight and cancer. How can we frame that with respect to what we've been told about skin cancer? And how can we add nuance to this topic? And finally, I'll be touching on how we can use the sun to help reduce death from cancer. So this story, it's actually quite an old story. And this is an ecological paper by a US MD back in 1940. His name was Frank Appley. And what he noticed, and he drew a conclusion, was that when he observed the mortality rates from cancer in the United States and Canada, that there was essentially an inverse relationship or an association. And he made the comment that the total cancer mortalities of the various American states and Canadian provinces are shown to fall with increasing solar radiation and the number of people exposed. So this generated an interesting hypothesis that basically wasn't touched for about 40 years, until two brothers, Cedric and Frank Garland, who are epidemiologists in California, San Diego, and they in 1980 posited or asked the question, does sunlight and vitamin D reduce the likelihood of colon cancer? So they're interested in colorectal cancer. And they proposed that vitamin D was a protective factor against colon cancer. What they did is they did, and I guess drawing on the work of people like Frank Appley, because they noted that if they were looking at the geographical distribution of cancer and cancer deaths, that the mortality and colon cancer prognosis, which is another key aspect of this, was that it was lowest in places with higher solar exposure, and it was highest in places where the populations were exposed to the least amounts of natural light, namely major cities and rural areas at high latitudes. So what they did is a study, and this was 8 years later. They did an 8-year prospective cohort study, and what they found, and they essentially compared the risks of developing colon cancer and they were stratified that by the level of vitamin D. And we're going to talk about vitamin D and its role in this story. But essentially what they noticed was the lower that your vitamin D level was, the more likely you were to develop colorectal cancer. And what they said in this paper back in the 1980s was that the results are consistent with the protective effect of serum 25 hydroxyvitamin D on colon cancer. So to frame this talk, we need to understand a little bit about physiology and about how the sun affects our skin and affects our biological system. So what we have is sunlight, and uniquely UVB sunlight, and that's a narrow range of light that actually hits planet Earth, and it's only present for the majority of time when a sufficient solar angle allows for these high energy photons to penetrate the atmosphere. What it does is it hits the skin and it converts cholesterol, 7-dehydrocholesterol, into vitamin D. And the reason it does that is because these UVB photons are sufficiently high energy to transform one of these rings into a vitamin D-like structure. So that process is reliant on a whole bunch of different things, but the key things that will affect that is the presence and absence of enough UVB-containing sunlight, as well as how much melanin exists in the skin. And we're going to talk about melanin and skin pigmentation and how relevant that is, particularly with regard to skin cancer. So what happens, and this is a schematic of the physiology of vitamin D, is that vitamin D is formed and then it binds in circulation to a binding protein before being taken to the liver and then the kidney and undergoes a range of hydroxylation and essentially activation steps before it is able to be used. As you can see here, you can also obtain vitamin D from the diet, and it's essentially pre-formed because you've consumed animals that themselves have made this fat-soluble hormone. But really, the vitamin D level is primarily going to be determined by solar exposure, because the sun is the main way that we as humans generate and maintain a vitamin D level. So what's the role of vitamin D? Well, most of you would know about the bone effects, and the research or the benefits of sunlight and UV-containing light predated the actual discovery of this compound. And in the late 1800s, in the ghettos of Europe, during the Industrial Revolution, there was smog that was preventing ultraviolet light from penetrating into these areas, and kids were getting severe vitamin D deficiency, and that was manifesting as rickets. And the bow leg the look of young children is the unfortunate consequence of inadequate bone development and ossification as a result of vitamin D deficiency. But what we've learned, and particularly over the last 15, 20 years, is that vitamin D and the vitamin D system is not only important for bone health, and it's actually far from it. It's a critical part of immune system function. And by extension, the cancer story, because it turns out that cancer in and of itself is extremely reliant on or dependent on the state of your immune system function. So things like the proliferation or growth of cells, inflammation, and new blood vessel growth, which is all, again, key part of the cancer story, this is regulated by vitamin D. So where else does this vitamin D sunshine hormone, what else does it touch? Well, I'm not going to speak about it in this lecture, but it is covering such a wide range of really critical aspects of optimal health and metabolic health, particularly insulin resistance, obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, as well as I mentioned, tumor formation, cancer formation, and immunity. And I'm going to explain now, but I'll explain later, is that vitamin D is actually also, and one way of thinking about this is a proxy for your total sunlight exposure. So that's going to be something I'll emphasize more. What else does the data suggest about cancer and vitamin D? Well, this study essentially is plotting breast cancer risk, and it plotted it against the serum vitamin D level. So what you can see is a pretty profound relationship where as the vitamin D concentration increases, and we've got both nanograms per mil, which is the US metric, and nanomoles per liter, which is us in Australia. So of the women who had in this whole cohort of 5,000, those who had a vitamin D level in the upper ranges, their risk of developing breast cancer was significantly lower. What about for those who've already developed cancer? And that's another part of this story. Well, it turns out that not only incidence, but also prognosis of cancer is profoundly related to, associated with serum vitamin D concentration. And this study suggested that the higher your vitamin D level, the lower your fertility rate in people who've already developed breast cancer. And again, patients with the highest concentration of 25-hydroxy-D had approximately half the fatality rate compared to those with the lowest. This systematic review covered and it summarized the state of the research. And it says that the evidence that chronic non-intermittent sun exposure decreases the risk of colorectal, breast, prostate cancer, non-Hodgkin lymphoma is accumulating and gradually getting stronger. This is nothing that we get taught in medical school. And this is not something that you as members of the public get communicated, especially with public health messaging around sun exposure in Australia. But this isn't locked in a musty case next to the JFK files. This is not private information. You can go onto PubMed and you can search this evidence, and it exists. So what this is pointing to is that we've got a strong evidence that the higher someone's sunlight exposure, as we measured via the vitamin D system, the lower the risk of the cancers that really kill people. And that's a key point. And I'll contrast that with skin cancers because as a cause of death in society, these are the cancers that are killing the most number of people. This is one of my favorite studies. It was actually published last year, finally, by Professor Richard Weller. Now, Richard Weller is the rarest of dermatologists who's actually looked into the data and found that sunlight exposure, it has a holistic benefit on health. And in this study, he essentially examined a database of over 400,000 people in the UK called the UK Biobank over about 12 years. And what he did is he stratified these people. He classified them based on their ultraviolet light exposure. So he used he used their latitude, which was a proxy for their UV exposure, as well as their sunbed tanning habits. And he correlated that to vitamin D levels. So what did he find? He found that participants with more active sun-seeking behavior and those living at lower latitudes had lower crude mortality of cancers of the digestive system. So I already told you that we already had strong evidence that it was linked to lower rates of colorectal cancer, but also breast cancer. Participants with active sun-seeking behavior had lower crude mortality from skin cancer. Big pause there. Cancers of respiratory and intrathoracic organs, cancers of lymphoid, hematopoietic, and related tissues, included, which are the leukemias, and cancers of the male genital organs. And they also summarize what I've just told you, which is an inverse relationship between solar exposure and cancer mortality in multiple sites, including the bladder, the colon, Hodgkin lymphoma, prostate, stomach, and breast. So this is really elegant because we've got multiple lines of epidemiological data, one using vitamin D, serum vitamin D, which is an indirect marker of sunlight exposure, and one more direct, looking at all-cause mortality and basically finding the same thing. So if sunlight lowers the cancer mortality, what are the mechanisms? So we have to talk a little bit about the solar spectrum. We have to talk a little bit about the light and how that affects the body. So what you have here is you have the spectral irradiance. So this is the solar energy that we get hit with on planet Earth, just standing outside, and we have the wavelength of light here. On this tiny corner here, this is the ultraviolet light. That is the UVA and the UVB light. UVB is only 5% of this. The rest is UVA. So you're only making vitamin D out of a small amount of UV light, and that is also going to change depending on your latitude. It's going to depend on your season, and it's also going to depend on time of day. What you can see with your eyes is the visible spectrum, and the largest area here by photon count is in the infrared, and that's non-visible. So ultraviolet is essentially below the visible spectrum. We can't see in ultraviolet, and infrared is beyond visible. The key point that I'd like you to understand about this diagram is that each one of these wavelengths of natural sunlight have a profoundly important effect on human physiology and human biology. The reason for that is because are the conditions of evolution for 3 billion years. And we evolved under this light, not under this light. As I said, vitamin D is only able to be made with UVB light. So what are the effects of UVB? And I'll be really specific because it's not only a vitamin D story. It stimulates this incredibly ancient and incredibly unique peptide prohormone called POMC, or pro-opiomelanocortin. Pro-opiomelanocortin, as I mentioned, is incredibly evolutionarily conserved. It's found in ancestral gnathosomes, which were relics from prehistoric time. It regulates things like immune function, appetite, and metabolism centrally in the hypothalamus, as well as blood pressure and obviously skin pigmentation. What it also regulates, and the downstream product of POMC is the skin tanning system. I think the most interesting part of one of the most interesting parts of POMC and its effect is that it contains an endorphin-like chemical. So when you get in the sun, the same peptide hormone that is assisting in tanning your skin is releasing a beta endorphin, an opioid-like chemical, to reward you for that tan. So again, think about this idea of tanning your skin cells in trauma, which is a half-truth. But if the sunlight is inducing tanning, but it's also rewarding you from being in there, and that's a 600 million-year-old program built into your biology, who's in the wrong here? What else does it do? As I mentioned, it can cause DNA damage and particularly creates these photoproducts and sunburn. What I'll explain about as we go through is that Mother Nature built in an extremely elegant program to help you repair those DNA damage caused by ultraviolet B light. So UVB is a double-edged sword, but it's absolutely essential for optimal human health. So what did Garland and Michael Hollick, who is the world leader on vitamin D, what did they say about the effects of vitamin D in cancer prevention? Because they were trying to explain this finding that there was lower colorectal, breast, prostate, and lower lymphoma findings with vitamin D exposure in sunlight. What they found is that the vitamin D compounds reduce the formation of new blood vessels in tumors. It reduces the malignant and excessive proliferation of cells. It increases or upregulates controlled cell death, or known as apoptosis, and it increases cell-to-cell adherence. And I mentioned briefly about this bioelectric model or a theory of explaining cancer, and this idea that the cell potentially loses its understanding that it's part of a structure in a whole, and therefore induces these anaplastic type phenomena in the cells. But luckily, vitamin D is helping those cells adhere to each other. Now, this is a complicated slide, but the purpose is really simple, and that is to explain to you that when you get in natural sunlight, it's not only the chemical that you take in a pill from the chemist. Because it turns out that the body makes a whole enormous pharmacy of related compounds that were initially thought to be biologically inert, but have since been discovered to have profoundly beneficial effects, and again, anti-cancer effects of promoting DNA repair in the skin cells and really systemically. So what else? How else can we account for this lower rates of cancer in people with greater sun and vitamin D exposure? Well, it turns out that your circadian rhythm is critical in regulating the essentially oncogenic process. And what is a circadian rhythm? Many of you might already know, but it's an endogenous almost 24-hour cycle that runs in the brain. The master clock exists in the hypothalamus behind the eye, and it sets a rhythm that needs to be synchronized across all tissues. And that rhythm programs the most critical functions of the body, from hormonal secretion, sleep-wake cycles, activity, metabolism, immune function, stem cells, you name it, is regulated on a 24-hour cycle. What you can do is that you can program your circadian rhythm by the behaviors and the lifestyle that you lead. So if you get bright light during the day, if you are asleep at nighttime and you consume your food during the day in a circadian appropriate manner, then you're going to get perfect synchrony between the clock in your eye and the peripheral clocks in your body. And that's going to lead to optimal health and optimal function of the body. If you do the opposite, then you are going to disrupt your circadian rhythm, and that's a problem. And that's a problem because your immune system, which is supposed to be killing these precancerous cells that we're spontaneously being generated, they're not going to be able to do that effectively. So circadian rhythm and cancer, like I mentioned, not only do you have clocks in all these different bodies that regulate these critical bodily processes, but the cancer killing mechanisms, so key cancer genes, they're all under circadian control. So cell cycle regulation, DNA repair, cell proliferation, and controlled cell death. If you are up all night till 2 a.m. looking at a blue lit screen, if you're giving your body those profoundly disrupting circadian signals, it will derail your endogenous cancer fighting and cancer killing mechanisms. So I think that is a big part of potentially these findings is that those who had a higher vitamin D were more likely to have a more regulated circadian rhythm, and therefore this circadian system was likely working more effectively. What's another way to account for these findings? Well, this is extremely new research, and Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder are experts in mitochondrial medicine and physiology. What they discovered is that the melatonin, which is the body's most potent antioxidant system, was not only being produced, not only antioxidant, but it's also a signal for darkness, and it induces sleep. It's not only being produced in the pineal gland, in the circulatory system on the absence of blue light, but it was actually being produced on site in your cells, in the mitochondria, during the day with exposure to near infrared light. So why is that important? Because it turns out that when the body is making this melatonin, extremely important antioxidant, this free radical scavenger and antioxidant, it is protecting the mitochondrial DNA. And the mitochondrial DNA, mutations in mitochondrial DNA underlie all this march towards chronic disease, including underlying the physiology of cancer and cancerous transformation. So simply being outside and being in greenery next to the green areas, you are absorbing massive amounts of near infrared light that are penetrating through your clothing and through your body up to at least 8 to 10 centimeters, and helping your body to synthesize melatonin, which it's using to essentially protect the cellular and subcellular machinery that is allowing your cells to work properly. How else is this working? Well, if we drill down into the mitochondria, we can see that this is the process by which energy is actually generated, and it's a passage of electrons. It's taking food electrons, it's taking light information, and it's allowing this electrochemical gradient to make energy in the form of ATP and also in the form of metabolic water. And metabolic water is this deuterium depleted water that gets produced at the fourth complex, cytochrome C oxidase. That process is optimized by natural sunlight in the form of all types of red light. These are chromophores, meaning they absorb light wavelengths and they're modulated by light wavelengths. So when the body is humming along, and when this mitochondrial engine is humming along, and you put the appropriate fuel in the form of a low carb seasonal diet that's rich in animal foods and deuterium depleted animal fats, then this process is aided. But it's never going to be optimally aided unless you're in natural sunlight, which, as I told you, is extremely rich in red light, because the red light is helping your mitochondria produce this metabolic water that is essentially hydrating all the proteins and enabling them to work properly, as well as spinning this fifth complex, which is producing ATP. So mitochondrial dysfunction is a prerequisite for cancerous transformation. It is one of the key problems that goes wrong when a cell becomes cancerous. And natural sunlight, not UV, but essentially red and infrared, is helping smooth this process. So the question I think is interesting is, do we have a marker? Do we have a marker of how much sunlight we have had? Do we have a fuel gauge? Because that would be really helpful in seeing where people are at with respect to their sunlight exposure. And we do, and that's essentially what the 25-hydroxy vitamin D test that you can get from your doctor will tell you. It's a storage form, but it is a rough proxy and a good indicator of your total sunlight exposure. And that's not only the UVB and vitamin D system, and that is why I believe it's one of the most important tests to get. We can explain about what we want and from an optimal level. So it can give us an indirect idea, because if someone's got a robust vitamin D level, then it will imply that they've had full spectrum sunlight exposure, including ample near infrared, which was the ancestral norm for our species. But if they've got a low, insufficient, or deficient level, then it implies that not only have they got the daytime sunlight exposure wrong, but they're probably exposed to some artificial light at night, and they're therefore having some degree of circadian rhythm disruption. Okay, so what about skin cancer? And now this is the critical point that, as I mentioned, is the nuance we need to give to understand this system and this process. So melanoma. Melanoma is the most concerning and dangerous of skin cancers. And the reason for that is because it has, relatively compared to the non-melanoma skin cancers, a much higher proportion for metastasis, spread, and therefore mortality. This is compared to the non-melanoma or keratinocyte cancers known as squamous cell and basal cell carcinoma. These non-melanoma skin cancers are not the cause of death in people. They're easily identified and they're easily treated. So the critical and most important issue here is the identification and prevention of melanoma. And no one's in argument or disagreement about that as a strategy. So how does skin cancer fit into this model about vitamin D? Because I just told you that all these really important cancers are associated with low vitamin D and therefore can be thought of as a product of sunlight deficiency. I don't know if anyone likes Star Wars, but this is one of my favorite memes. And Padme is asking, skin cancer patients should have a high vitamin D level from excess sunlight. And that, again, is the corollary of the advice to avoid the sun above a UV index of 3 because of the development of skin cancer. So if you extend that train of thought, those people who are developing skin cancer should have a pretty robust vitamin D level, because I told you that the only way you're generating a meaningful amount of vitamin D is through UVB exposure. So that stands to reason if we're following this logical train of thought. So this is a study from South Africa. It was a bunch of dermatologists did this research. So they looked at the vitamin D status of patients in Cape Town, so a very high UV index environment with non-melanoma skin cancer. So what did they find? They found that 49% of those with non-melanoma skin cancers were vitamin D deficient and 31 were insufficient. And they used a cutoff of 50 nanomoles per liter. So interesting. Even in the tumors and the cancers that are canonically said to be related to cumulative UV exposure, we're still seeing a significant association with vitamin D deficiency. What about this one? Malignant melanoma, vitamin D status as a risk and prognostic factor. Now, this is a meta-analysis that was published in January of 2025. So this one is hot off the press, and it is a synthesis of the research for the past, well, up to date, with respect to the relationship of melanoma and vitamin D. So what did these researchers find? This is the conclusion. We observed significantly increased risks for thicker tumors, mitotic tumors, so those with higher cell replication, higher tumor stages, so cancers that are more down the track of spread in vitamin D deficient patients. The conclusion was this study demonstrates an association between low vitamin D status and both increased melanoma risk and worsened prognosis. And that's further contributing to the growing body of evidence supporting the tumor-effective role of vitamin D. So Vince thinks that's pretty astounding. That's pretty against what we're being told. We've been told to avoid the sun to prevent melanoma and prevent UVB exposure above a UV index of 3 with broad spectrum sunscreens. But that's flying in the face. So what else? What about in patients that already have malignant melanoma? And this is a British study, and it looked at 123 patients, and they had malignant melanoma, and it obviously excluded patients taking supplemental vitamin D. What did it find? It found that 84% of these patients were vitamin D deficient, and of these, 31 were severely deficient. How did that break down? So as you can see, the more mild your malignant melanoma, the less likely you were to have vitamin D deficiency. And all the way at the bottom, the stage 4, distant metastasis, very poor prognosis. It's improved since the invention of immunotherapies, which has been a great invention, but it stands to reason that this is a massive finding. Of 89% were vitamin D deficient. Again, these are in patients with metastatic melanoma. So the question then, and I think I've already answered it, but I'm going to continue to prompt you to think about is, how do you become vitamin D deficient? The reason you become vitamin D deficient is because you're avoiding UV light. And you're using UV blocking broad spectrum sunscreens, which necessitate or necessarily block UV light. The dermatologists know this, and they're trying to understand this to the effect of supplementation unsuccessfully, but they haven't understood that the critical reason why this is happening or association is because the patients are lacking in key anti-cancer compounds made by full spectrum UV containing sunlight. So this is just a pause and a digestion of what I've just said. So how again can UV light be so intimately associated with both optimal health but also these severe cancer outcomes? This is a really interesting study, and again, it was done to investigate health outcomes in women, and they took 25,000 Swedish women, and they followed them for 20 years, inquiring at baseline about sun exposure habits. Do they tan in winter? Do you tan in summer? Do you use tanning beds? And do you travel overseas to tan? And the hypothesis of these researchers was that those who tanned the most, who had the most sun-seeking behavior, would get the most melanoma and then would die more frequently. And really that was their hypothesis. And that's why they called it the melanoma in southern Sweden study. So they were right about the first thing. The women with the most sun exposure did get the most melanoma, but they were completely wrong about the second part, because it turned out that the women with the most active sun-seeking behavior had the lowest mortality. And that was a dose-dependent effect, with the ones who avoided the sun having the greatest mortality. The conclusions of the paper was that sun avoidance was a risk factor on par with smoking for all-cause mortality. And the way they worked that out is that they found that the women who smoked but got sunlight and sought the sun and went tanning, they had the same mortality as the women who avoided the sun and didn't smoke. So that's a magnitude equivalence of risk factor for all-cause death. What they put it down to was the women who were tanning were dying less of cardiovascular disease, stroke, but it turns out that they were also dying less of skin cancer. So this graph was a plot of those without skin cancer, those with non-melanoma skin cancer, and those with malignant melanoma, and it was the odds of death, odds of all-cause mortality. And as you can see, in the groups, the women who avoided the sun, in each situation, they diligently wore their sunscreen. They had the highest odds of all-cause mortality, and the tanning, the ones getting up there in their bikinis from the morning to the evening in Sweden had the lowest mortality, and that was consistent finding. What did Peli Lindqvist say? He's the chief investigator, and he's one of the world leaders in investigating the systemic effect and benefit of sunlight on health. He said, there is a relationship between high sun exposure and malignant melanoma incidence, but an inverse relationship to prognosis. Thus, high UV exposure increases the incidence, as in more people are going to be diagnosed with melanoma, while low sun exposure habits on vitamin D levels have been linked to thicker, more aggressive melanoma with shorter survival times. So, very, very profound study, which is explaining that there's this trade-off, a very important trade-off. I'll quickly revisit this data from Professor Weller, because what did they find? They replicated the findings of the melanoma in southern Sweden study. They showed that those with greater sun exposure had lower mortality. So what's the mechanism here? Why? How can we explain this? I told you about these chemical cousins of vitamin D. Well, it turns out that they have an immense and very fascinating and profound anti-cancer benefit. So this vitamin D here, pre-vitamin D3, becomes vitamin D. If you stay in the sun and you continue to irradiate your skin with ultraviolet B, this becomes lumisterol, techisterol, and a whole bunch of other compounds. What do these do? These upregulate DNA repair enzymes in the skin. The UVB is damaging it, and the base excision repair and all kinds of other DNA repair mechanisms are promoted by these vitamin D metabolites. So I think that is going to be one of the profound reasons why we're seeing lower mortality in people with greater sun exposure. Now, what are the causes of skin cancer? And look, I'm going to explain my current thinking about this. And this isn't by any means complete, but it's how I'm thinking about it at the moment. And there's always going to be an interaction of genetic predisposition with environmental factors. So I always tell my patients that genetics loads the gun, and your environment, your choices, your lifestyle, it pulls the trigger. What are the genetic predispositions? Those with pale skin types, those with less melanin in their skin. And it's very rare, very certain genetic syndromes. And there's one there called xeroderma pigmentosum. It's characterized by mutations that prevent those base excision repair enzymes, those DNA repair enzymes from working. So how do you marry this with lifestyle? Well, it turns out if you have a disrupted circadian rhythm by looking at blue light all day, all night, and not enough full spectrum sunlight during the day, you're going to impair DNA repair and the cancer defense mechanisms. If you have a low vitamin D level and you're near infrared light deficient, you're not going to be making that antioxidant melatonin hormone. If you're immunosuppressed, people on transplant recipients have extreme high risk of developing melanoma, non-melanoma skin cancer. And that explains because they're hamstringing their body's natural repair and immune surveillance mechanisms. What else? And I haven't talked a lot about food, but it's a extremely common and recurrent anecdote that once people go carnivore, or they cut out polyunsaturated vegetable oils, seed oils, refined oils, that they find that they're prevented from burning. They're essentially resistant to the effects of UVB light. They're less photosensitive. We know, and it's not a talk for today, but we know that omega-3 and the DHA, the EPA fatty acids, they confer photoprotective benefits in the skin. And as a society, we've collectively deviated from an ancestrally normal and appropriate omega-3 to 6 ratio because everyone is under-eating marine seafoods and everyone's over-eating refined seed oils. So I think that is a key effect modifier for the development of skin cancer. What else? melanoma is unique, and we do see melanoma commonly in more younger people. Again, they're typically an indoor worker. They have low vitamin D, but it turns out that there's a photoreceptor system, the melanopsin non-visual photoreceptor system. This regulates melanocyte function. So if we're sitting in front of a blue lit screen all day and we're sitting under blue light, then this light is highly stimulatory to melanocytes. So I believe that the indoor environment is a key part of particularly melanoma diagnosis in younger people. So how can we think about deliberate sun exposure on a broad level? Because we have to be weighing up the benefits and the risks of sunlight exposure and sunlight avoidance. Well, I think that data and evidence suggests that we're trading up a reduced all-cause death, reduced cancer death, reduced skin cancer death, and a lower cardiovascular death up against potentially a greater number of skin cancers, both melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancers, and they're particularly going to be in those fair-skinned phototypes. Reduction in cardiovascular death is a massive part of the benefit of natural sunlight, and that was a talk I did last year, which is a critical part of this story. So quickly, let me discuss how we're going to use the sun to help reduce our mortality from cancer. So there's a couple of really general steps here, but what we want to do is we want to understand our ancestry. We want to understand our risk factors. We need to understand our ambient UV conditions, and we're going to titrate our sun exposure based on those things. We want to target a vitamin D level. Again, this is going to be a marker of our sun exposure to a certain amount in approximately around 125. And obviously, we're going to check for any suspicious lesions that might be forming as a result of an increased sun exposure habits. For a quick explanation, this is the Fitzpatrick photo scale, and from 1 to 5. And on 1, you have the most pale Northern European, the Ranger, and at 6 you've got the darkest, Sudanese, West African, Somalian, perhaps, Australian Aboriginal phototype. And what you have here is a gradient of melanin in the skin, and that's a gradient of pigment in the epidermis. The number of melanocytes aren't changed, but the amount of melanin that they've secreted into the skin has. And the question is, what accounts for this difference? The answer is the ambient UV light. In Scandinavia, the UV index doesn't climb above 6 most of the year, and for 1 week it climbs above, it hits about 6. In the places where people have the highest pigmentation, they're being bombarded year-round at the equator with massive amounts of UV light. So it's a response to the ambient UV conditions. The other key point, and I put it in small letters, but it's important to note, is that the less melanin you have, the easier it is to make vitamin D. That means because the melanin itself is absorbing and dissipating this UV light as heat. So amongst a range of other effects. But the benefit of being pale in a high UV area is that you need a very little amount. And really, when we're thinking about light, we're thinking about essentially a drug-like replacement. So we need to consider that this is a dosing that we're giving ourselves. And we can dose ourselves, but we have to be smart about the dose. Another way of thinking about this is what I'm calling a skin type latitude mismatch. So you have to ask yourself, do you live in a similar solar environment to your ancestors? If yes, then you're matched and your skin type's appropriate for the conditions that you live in. Sun exposure habits are much easier then because you don't have to mitigate as much because you're in the environment that your ancestors were evolved and you have the appropriate amount of melanin in your skin. But us in Australia, most people are mismatched, and you can actually be mismatched in 2 directions. You can be a fairer skinned person in a higher UV index area, which is most of Australia's Northern European migrants historically, or you can be a darker person in a lower UV environment. As you can imagine, it's much more difficult to be dark in an area with low UV light than it is to be a light skin pigment in a high UV area. The reason is because if you're shame worn, you can go in the shade. That is a key point. You can titrate your solar exposure by using shade. Unfortunately, for Stormzy here, there's not enough UV light in the UK year round to give him his sunlight needs. And that actually is associated with a whole bunch of interesting phenomenon related to sunlight deficiency and how that's affecting health disparities. And this disparity in health outcomes, particularly in the US, but also in the UK, between African American, African British, and the native population. Greater rates of obesity, diabetes, cancer, stroke, and heart attack. I believe it's related to the solar exposure and the inadequate amount of solar exposure that you're going to get as a dark person in a low UV environment. What are some key risk factors? So if you've got a personal history of melanoma, if you've got a family history of melanoma, again, if you're taking medications that are going to suppress the body's response or repair mechanisms to UV light, and if you've got many atypical nevi or funny moles. None of these are necessarily absolute contraindications to UV exposure, but it has to be taken on a case-to-case basis. You have to understand the solar conditions. The UV index is a measure of UVB intensity. And if you go into any weather website, you'll be able to see what that UV light is doing during the day. So again, as I mentioned, seasonally this will change. But here in Australia, we can get in summer many days, 11 and above, and that's a very high UV dose. Compared to Tassie, Brisbane, Townsville, everyone is extremely different. So it pays to understand how much UV light you're dealing with. It's relevant to know that you can't make vitamin D and you therefore can't get burnt at all parts of the solar day. Again, the sun angle is the primarily determinant of how much UV light comes in. And when that is reaching above 45 degrees, you're going to be getting UVB light. So the morning and the evening, you can safely get your full body out there, and it's encouraged to do so prior to UV light exposure. But just be aware that you're not going to be making vitamin D in that time, but you're getting other benefits for circadian rhythms and other physiological functions. So regulating your circadian rhythm, it's easier said than done. Bright light during the day and darkness or moonlight at night. And we can disrupt the circadian rhythm either by getting insufficient natural sunlight during the day or excess light at night. So minimizing light at night, mitigating with things like blue light blocking glasses with red and light or candle light close to the ground. These are all relatively straightforward, but give you very high value ways of helping preserve your circadian rhythm and therefore preserve your immune cell function, preserve the cancer machinery's ability to kill cancer cells at the right time. And what do you do then? You can titrate your sun dose. And this is an app that was developed by Professor Michael Hollick, his team, to help dose sunlight based on your phototype, based on the ambient UV conditions. It makes it really easy. Circadian is another app to help you understand what time of day is sunlight present in my environment. Finally, you want to build your solar callus, and really you want to expose your whole body. What was the norm before clothes were invented? Well, from sunset to sunrise to sunset, full body irradiation on our skin. That is what our biology needs. And a lot of people haven't had sunlight on private parts in decades. And that is a problem if we're trying to prevent cancer, when we understand the potential and powerful role of these vitamin D and these other secosteroids, as well as near-infrared light. So what's an appropriate vitamin D level? Well, this work by Hollick et al., they looked at where does the vitamin D level land in free-ranging humans. In non-human primates, it gets to anywhere between 125 to 200. In the Maasai and Hadzabe in Tanzania, it sits at about 115. These guys look like a phototype 5 or 6. They have a massive amount of melanin, but they're still maintaining a serum vitamin D level that is double the average Canadian and I would say double the average Australian because they're simply outside all day. I mean, how else can we look at this. Outdoor workers, they'll naturally have levels of 163. Puerto Rican farmers 135, 122. So the average Canadian is 68. I would tell you from anecdotal clinical experience measuring my patients' vitamin D, it's probably a little bit higher than that, maybe 78 or 80. But it's nowhere near. Most people are not getting close to those levels. And Australian dermatologists, this is an interesting one because it's proof that they're eating their own cooking. But 35 nanomoles is deficient, and it's deficient no matter what metric you use. And this is a graph that explains the different units for both UK and US. But beyond under 50 is classified as mild deficiency in Australia. Above 75 is where we stop seeing bone complications like subtle subclinical osteomalacia. If you can get your vitamin D above 75, and that's a good threshold for supplementation to get above. But really, the sweet spot for cancer prevention long term is going to be above 100, and that is putting yourself into the lowest risk groups of those epidemiological studies that I presented to you earlier on. Obviously, if you have suspicious lesions, they need to be identified, and we're really particularly worried about pigmented lesions. So identify concerning factors that include asymmetry in any lesions, multiple different pigments, rapid change, and anything's concerning. Luckily, we have some of the best skin doctors in Australia. These can be readily identified and excised, which is great. The slide I didn't include is the story about melanoma overdiagnosis, and it's a little bit of a interesting and controversial topic, but the data is clear that there's some degree of that happening not only in the US but here in Australia too, and it's driven by it's driven by diagnostic creep in terms of what previously would have been called a pre-malignant lesion, or is now being called a melanoma in situ, and that's been driven by a whole range of factors. Particularly in the US, it's related to profit and the structure of their system that rewards melanoma diagnosis. But that's not really relevant to you as individuals, because if you have anything that's concerning, it needs to be looked at. So let's end on a meme, because I love memes and I love the Matrix. And what Neo is saying here is you're saying that those people with cancer patients should, including with melanoma, should sunbathe to reduce the risk of dying. Keyword being dying. And Morpheus says yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. So if you're interested in any more of this, then join my private community group. I've actually put together a much very detailed course about a safe and appropriate sensible sunlight exposure that includes the nuances I've touched on, called Solar Callus, with a whole bunch of lessons, and include on things like photosensitizing medications, the role of circadian rhythms, and how to optimize everything. So check that out if you want to dive into a bit more depth. And I've got a whole bunch of free podcasts on my channel that go into this in further depth, including with Professor Richard Weller, who and Dr. Jack Cruz, who have done a lot on this topic. My talk last year is aimed at the cardiovascular benefit. And if you want to learn from me and you want to experience how I do the solar exposure and how I recommend you do it, then join me on a couple of retreats in July. That's always a fun time. So thank you very much for listening.
Can you please turn the main mic on up the front?
Max Gulhane, everybody, give it up. A beacon of wisdom and knowledge. We've got a couple questions. Yeah, okay. We got Cindy over here. Look at those hands shoot up. Gary.
Everybody goes out into the sunshine and they put their sunglasses on. Will you address that, please?
Yeah, so photoreception is not only a cutaneous process, and that basically means that your eyes are detecting light wavelengths, and that there's a feedback loop that exists between the eye, the brain, and the skin that regulates pigmentation. That means for optimal, for that process to occur properly, you need a coherence between the signal that the eye is receiving with regard to its ultraviolet environment and the skin. If you wear sunglasses that block ultraviolet A and B, they block up to 400 nanometer light, you are going to deactivate or create a discrepancy in those signals that is going to impair the tanning process. And that evidence is very old, and it's been done in fish and lower order animals that, like frogs, that show that pigmentation is occurring because of what is the light information that's being received through the eye.
Does that include seeing glasses?
So to a lesser degree, depending on the lens type, but if they're UV blocking, then to some degree they're going to impair that process. Yeah, so any car windscreens, yes, absolutely, because they again are they're just changing the proportion of light that you're receiving, because they preferentially block UVB. They permit a little bit of UVA, and they permit more blue than infrared. So they're changing the proportion or the form but which the light is being delivered to the eyes and skin, and that's different to the 3 billion years that your body's evolved with.
Max, thank you for continuing my confusion with vitamin D and UVB light, because I think there's a double paradox there which keeps repeating, you articulated it very well. I'd like to come to the defence of UVA and ask you a couple of questions about that. UVA light, which we've got a lot more here the further south you go, stimulates nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide is the critical chemical which actually is involved in our T killer cell response to cancer. So UVA light is very beneficial for cancer mop-up rather than cancer prevention. Uric acid, byproduct of fructose, inhibits nitric oxide production. That's in some of my talks, but I want to defend UVA light because not everyone can get out just for the right number of minutes in the middle of the day. The other one is linoleic acid, which you alluded to there, is well associated now with 10 years of literature, that there are people that with melanoma have much higher levels in the fat cells of that, because melanoma is increasing and predominantly found down in the non-sun exposed areas. That's really just, so how can we worry about UVB? That the worrying thing about linoleic acid is, which just comes from the seed oils, is the half-life of it's probably about 4 years. So if you want to get rid of it out of your diet, you can improve your metabolic health straight away, but it's going to probably take a few years. So can you defend UVA?
Yeah, so UVA is a critical part of this whole sunlight story. And I didn't particularly include its mechanisms as it relates to cancer, but with respect to optimal health, UVA is key. And for the reasons that you mentioned, not only, as you've said, it liberates nitric oxide from the vessels, the blood vessels, and it helps to dilate it. So, if we're thinking about a patient with essential hypertension with metabolic syndrome who's got hypertension, yes, there's an insulin-resistant component to that and the effect of insulin on renal sodium absorption. But I think that patient is sunlight deficient and they're UVA deficient, amongst a bunch of other things. The other point about UVA is that Weller's group noted that UVB actually can lower blood pressure too. So it's not only an isolated UVA effect, but it's essentially a lot of the short wavelength, including blue, can cause photorelaxation and dilation of blood vessels. So I'm a massive fan of UVA. As I mentioned, the vitamin D here is the biomarker of total sunlight exposure. So I think the benefit for cancer too absolutely could be UVA related, but and near infrared related. So it's the whole package. It's difficult. No, exactly. We don't have a biomarker like we do that I'm aware of to measure someone's UVA exposure in isolation. On the point of linoleic acid and melanoma, yeah, I definitely agree. I think to be really nuanced, it seems like the cancer in non-sun exposed areas, that seems to be superficial, because there's multiple types of melanoma, which we didn't go into. Superficial spreading melanoma in younger patients on non-exposed areas, like on the finger, typically in a very pale 25-year-old office worker. Absolutely. And that's why I alluded to the artificial light, alluded to the fatty acid components. In older patients who have, lentigo maligna, some of these more chronic sun-exposed areas do get melanoma, but they're nowhere near the metastatic risk of those other melanoma types. So, yeah, I guess I agree with you, Gary. I think this story is so much more nuanced than what we're being presented with, and the strategy of slathering everyone in sunscreen and sunlight avoidance is essentially preventing anyone from building any resistance or building the natural physiological response to sunlight. So they're even more weakened when they do go into sunlight, which might be a couple times a year. You get fried to a crisp. And the epidemiology suggests that's the predominant risk factor for developing melanoma from an epidemiological point of view.
Great talk, Max. Thanks so much. My understanding of melanomas is that it's sun damage in infants, children, rather than adults. And I just wonder how that would affect some of the figures you found because you're looking at adults who may have then stopped their sun exposure, and so they may have been burnt as a child, and so I'm going to protect myself. But it's more, so I'm worried also that people may be watching this and then go away and say, oh, I'm going to keep my kids out there, but are they still at risk? Yeah,
so the emphasis needs to be made that there's no evidence that low-level amount of non-burning sun exposure is linked to any adverse health effect. The issue, as you've identified, is signal for intermittent severe sunburn in childhood. I think, and maybe I'll explain it a little bit more, the average age, the median age of melanoma diagnosis is 68. It's in the late 60s. So what I believe is actually happening here is people with a pale phototype, one or two, most Australians, are potentially had a number of severe burn episodes early in life. They they ate their high cereal diet their whole time. They went inside and worked in a bank or an office for 50 years. And then age 60, because they're so vitamin D deficient and they're sunlight avoided and their circadian rhythm disruption, they develop a malignant melanoma that metastasizes and kills them. So potentially that early in life sunburn was impactful for them. But is that a reason to dissuade people from appropriately getting gradual, safe amount of UVB containing light? I don't think that's the case. But as I said, I'm not advocating for burning by any means. And the paler you are, the earlier in the day, you can safely get UV light before going in because the UV index is lower. And that's probably the most conservative way to advise UV exposure. If your ancestry is from Sweden, where it doesn't get above a UV index of 6, then know the UV conditions of your environment. And the moment that UV index climbs to 10, because you've got your Swedish ancestry, go inside. You still generated sufficient, more than enough vitamin D and beneficial sunlight in that time. But it's culture in Australia for us to go out in the midday, but we've got our sunscreen on, and really spend a lot of time in an area that would require us to be as dark as those Sudanese people. But not many people are really getting that.
Sorry, guys, that's all we got time for. If you got any more questions, ask Max in the break. Dr. Max Gulhane.